Hello, my name is Tatenda Nzingha Mazowe, and welcome to another episode of the Baobab Sessions As It Is. Today we have a very exciting guest. Her name is Samara, and I'm excited for her to introduce herself to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Tatenda. I really appreciate it. I feel very honored that you invited me here today. So my full name is Samara Ragaven, but I go by Samara because a lot of people couldn't pronounce my name when I was growing up. So they used to say Shanti. So Samara is kind of the name that I was given, that I really love. And I was born in Montreal, in Canada, and then moved to South Africa when I was 6, and then moved to the States after that. And so I've kind of lived all over and experienced different places and spaces, which I really appreciate because I'm a clinical psychologist, and I think that it's taken me many different lives to get to where I am today, not just the kind of physical spaces, but I think the experiences that come with that. And I think, and I hope that helps to kind of better relate and meet my patients or clients where they are. So I'm very grateful for belonging to different communities, because I think community is so important.
So if I had to ask you, as someone who is meeting you, and I'm present with you in this moment, I see you, I am here, what would you like me to know about you?
I mean, I think it's interesting that you said, I see you, because I think all of us in the world want to be seen, right? And I think for me, there's nothing quite like, and I feel like I'm on the opposite end of usually I think where I sit in my professional praxis. But I think we all just want to be seen. I think, maybe the one, I'm very much into free association, and I think what just comes to your mind is generally what works best. And for me, maybe the ability to be seen as somebody who can go on a journey safely with somebody else.
Okay, that's really beautiful. That's beautiful. And I wonder, like in your journey, like in your capacity to empathize, like you emphasize that you were born in Canada, you lived here, and you lived in the United States. Could you tell me more about how you see yourself as a being? Like the stories or the tapestries or the pieces that make you you as a whole?
Yeah, I think, when people in this world have multiple identities, I think it confuses people. And I think we live in a world that loves to box because I think it makes people feel safe, right? To be able to already have a preconceived narrative of somebody. And what helps us is like these very kind of binary ideas of how somebody can exist in the world. And so if I think about myself, a lot of people I think would say, oh, she must be so confused. Where does she belong? And my mom is white and my dad is Indian from here. My mom's from the US. And so I think people have often looked at me, and I'm also Jewish and Hindu. So I think even spiritually people are confused. And I think that's actually what it's been the people in the communities that both my parents have actually tried to incorporate and work into our intimate lives that has, I think, shaped me into the person that I am today. So I can't take full credit, is basically what I'm saying. And I think it's other people holding it.
But how did that feel? Mm-hmm. Because you have a rich ethnic background. Mm-hmm. Was there ever a moment in time where you are in harmony with yourself, you just are, but then you came into being through the eyes of another person So they read you and they read your background and they started constraining you or defining you or creating expectations around your identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think everybody can relate to that. A moment in time where somebody basically projects, right, their own generally insecurities or, their own complex relationship with themselves generally, right? And they project that onto you. And of course, part of my job is holding all of that, right? But outside of that space, of course, strangers do it. Micro interactions are infused inherently, I think, with judgment, but also politics, and also a discourse that is liminal that we can't even see. I think it's constantly happening. I see you smiling.
It's true, and it's true because I love the way you say projections are insecurities. Because we have to make sense of ourselves somehow, right? And if you aren't what I think you are, what is that going to say about me? If you don't meet my expectations of my reality, what is that going to say about me and my expectations and the things that I've put in place to make me make sense? And how have you navigated that, especially as someone of mixed heritage? Have you had those moments? Because I'm assuming you have had those moments, right? Have you had those moments where you are present as yourself, but someone wants to place meaning onto who you are?
I think it's interesting because there's two words that I'm picking up on, which I feel like I want to explore with you, which is around conflict, and this idea of an internal maybe imbalance or something that's been created by another or somebody else. And I guess I'm smiling because I think about kind of the idea of intragroup and intergroup is like what's coming to my mind, where the amount of times I think people want to co-opt you if they like what they see into their community. But then when it's something that doesn't align, at least overtly, they're quick to reject, even if you have that identity, right? And I guess I'm thinking of myself in terms of, Judaism, where people are like, oh, you can't be a Jew because you're brown. And I'm like, oh, that's so fascinating because I'm pretty sure the first Jews were not white. But, and so even though I was raised Jewish, we were kosher at home, kosher curry because my dad cooked, he was the primary chef. So I think, that, and then Indians who are like, yes, oh my God, you're Indian, and the colorism, of course, in India is strong. So the fact that I'm light-skinned is like, yes, you're Indian, right? And so I think about this idea of people projecting something onto you when they want something to fit into their community, because it is, and if it doesn't fit, they're so quick to reject. And where does that leave your own experience, right? Where does it leave you saying, actually, I want to be part of this community? And I think for me, I think I've had to learn and cultivate comfort in these communities in myself, and also seek out these other communities that are within them, because it's like a Russian doll, right? There are larger communities, and then you slowly start to find your people. I think as you start to find, as you said, the tapestry of what your own life can look like. And you're pulling from things all the time, and I guess the idea is can we have a certain level of power in ourselves to decide which communities and spaces we want to belong to, and identities?
I mean, that is a question, and I never realized that there was nuance, because for me, the communities that you belong to are communities that I sit outside of, right? That I can appreciate cultural elements, that I can appreciate traditions, philosophies, but they're communities that I sit outside of. And I have to ask myself certain things, because in African culture, and I say African, Southern African, there has been a great awareness of the importance of rites of passage. So it's beyond having a name and speaking a language, but to spiritually belong, you have to have undergone certain rites of passage. And there's a lot of talk around, this can cause a sense of conflict or a sense of loss in your innate sense, rather than in actual like three-dimensional reality.
Yes.
So I want to ask you, as someone who is both Jewish and Indian, how is your Judaism received in your Indian community? And how is your mixed background received in your Jewish community? Especially because rabbinical law says that if your mother is Jewish, you are Jewish, period. And what has your experience been, and what has that shown you about the barriers that people create and what people hold on to in order to give meaning to their identities?
Yeah, and I guess what I'm also hearing you say is how the almost, I think, invitation, I feel like, that is like gifted to an individual from the community is in some ways a way to, as you said, keep safe, right? It's like if we let anybody in, you know, then is our traditions still safe, right? And there's something about that that I'm thinking about as we're sitting here, because I think I have experienced exclusion in the Jewish community, of course, because especially due to kind of apartheid Palestine and what's happening in the Middle East and the kind of colonization that's going on there, and I think they also, a lot of Ashkenazi white Jews see me and think immediately I'm Arab or brown or something that is threatening them, which I don't agree with. I can say that very clearly on camera that that's what's happening in Israel is not is ethically incredibly sad considering the Holocaust, and Jews should know better, I think. But the reality for myself is that when you also have, you find Jews, for example, who are pro-Palestine, and you can find those spaces. But I think that my presence and my body unnerves white Jews because I think it makes them have to grapple with maybe even consciously and unconsciously what they're doing right now in Palestine.
Right.
And so the idea is, I think at some point we also have to decide how much stress and pain are we going to put ourselves through our bodies to fit into something. And I'm not saying that being alone is always good, but I think we need to, our energy is very precious, and especially now, I feel that with what's going on in the world, it's even more of a scarce resource. And I think we just need to be cautious about how much we extend in order to make others feel comfortable with our presence.
I relate to that in so many ways. I relate to that as someone who practices African spirituality. And for me, what I'm hearing is this is a heart and soul thing. And how I've experienced that is the not enoughness paradigm, as though my very embodied presence is not enough. And it's it makes me wonder how much of who we are is based on history, and how much of who we are is based on acceptance of present realities. And I wonder what it is, especially around our categories and categorizations, how much of the labels that we put on people and insist that people have is a form of neurosis, is a form of policing, is trauma responding to itself, and how much of that is actually appreciation, culture, and heritage.
And so I think that's a very good kind of spectrum that we're straddling, right, all the time, of what can, I guess what I think about, and it's funny, I'm picking up on the word neuroses, and kind of a sense of wanting to feel safe again, right? Because kind of being neurotic is also a way of trying to make sense of something that, well, the world, which I don't know, maybe you can help me, but I can't make sense of it. Right? It's messy. It's really, really messy. And I think and yet, you know, if I think about it too, there are certain things that I believe when I meet somebody who, so for example, I'm queer, if I meet somebody else who's queer, there is like a sense of family, understanding, right, that makes me feel safer. So maybe it's also the types of communities and how they're portrayed in the larger world and universe, right? And that goes back to maybe representation and how things are represented, which is why I think what you're doing here is so important, because it feels like, I could be wrong, but that you're shifting, I think, what people have thought they knew and maybe don't always know, because we never know, or the world is full of unknowing.
So what I am doing is, you are creating an archive and you are creating the present. I feel like I've only seen certain dialogues in South Africa, about South Africa, for South Africa, from South Africa. And it's not necessarily true. I reject essentialism, especially around different bodies and beings in a nation. I see how it hurts in the long run, because I think about South Africa, and I'd love to unpack this with you, is we're very clear on our history. We're clear on our history, but who are we now? Post-Rainbow Nation branding, what can we say is South Africa? What is our experience? Because it feels to me and has felt to me that we're all almost carrying a handkerchief in our pockets, and we wipe our tears every day as a nation. That's something I didn't know. That's not a conversation that I had heard. I'd heard about the global north and loneliness, but something that I take for granted in South Africa is maybe we do know how to connect.
Yeah.
You know, that we aren't just a traumatized society. And when I think about intergenerational trauma, I think about the impact it has on our ability to individuate. I think about the impact it has on our ability to make choices. I think about the impact it has on our ability to be. In your practice, in your experience, what is the impact of intergenerational trauma in real time, in reality?
You know, I once again, as you said, there's no monolith, right? There's nothing, and I don't also want to say that. I think it's interesting what you said about individuation, because I guess when I think about even what we're doing, which is like almost a parallel process, I feel like of some, you know, my day to day of being with somebody wholly and sitting with them and seeing them, or trying to, that there is that's an individual experience, right? But so much of what we bring into the room, and we're doing it now too, even though it's just the two of us, is about like, how do you fit into the community? How do you fit? I mean, it's almost like we can't stop ourselves from talking about it, you know? Right. But like, let's individuate and just be me, and then it's like, but everybody else, you know, how do they see us? Like, how are we perceived? And, you know, which is also very humanistic, right? Like, almost there's this idea that as much as we want to say, like, fuck everybody else and fuck society, where I think that's part of the South African, like, but did I offend them? Was I okay? Is everybody comfortable? You know, there's this want to include and worry about other people. And so I think when I say my practice in terms of intergenerational trauma, there's of course lots of trauma, you know, and we can live with the statistics. We know, you know, GBV, we know in terms of service delivery, we understand the kind of complex like geopolitics of South African culture, and which I also try to shy away from in moments like this, because I think so many people think of South Africa as a statistic.
Right.
You know, which is why it's so beautiful what you're doing, because you're giving texture, and I really believe in that, coming from a public health background, that statistics tell you absolutely nothing about the humanness and the human experience, which is what makes up a system or a statistic. So we lose that in this kind of attempting to make things digestible for the population of generally the global north. So I think in terms of intergenerational trauma, you know, we know that. We know that it's impacting. We know it impacts everybody on a daily basis, depending on who you are, where you're living, you know, gender, race, sexuality. We know it impacts more, and it's painful. And I think people are trying really, really hard to break cycles of trauma. And also trying very, very hard to find joy.
In 3, 2, 1, action.
Okay, so you were saying about people trying very hard to overcome generational trauma. And that got me thinking, because my understanding of generational trauma's impact is it limits the scope of your own human possibility. So over time, people contract to who they are. They contract to what is possible for them. They contract even in what they're capable of experiencing and the richness of human interaction.
So is it okay? I'm going to kind of answer the question in parts, although I know you're asking it holistically, but maybe it's more digestible even for me to think about it in these different ways of we're not all on the same boat. I mean, I think we know positionality is a real thing, and we also know that especially in a country like South Africa, the privileged and everybody else, stark difference, right? In lived reality and in material reality, and spiritual reality to some degree. I'm not 100% clear on what, you know what I mean, but I do think there's a spiritual difference there. So, you know, something that popped out around the idea of privileged to be human. And that brings me back actually to what we were talking about around the external gaze, because I think that's what maybe we were talking about. You know, how do people see you? How do people gaze at you and make meaning for themselves, right? Either in a way that's hurtful, painful, raw, unkind, or positive, beautiful. You know, these are different. It's not a split, right? But I think the idea of putting it like it's a privilege to be human on a kind of grander scale makes sense in the idea of what we are allowed to express. I mean, a great example of that is around the idea of white tears or white woman tears, right? So I mean, I think that plays into who gets to experience certain emotions from an external gaze. Does that, and how that's interpreted, right? But do I believe that? I believe that trauma and intergenerational trauma gives some kind of idea and texture to what we can and can't do and how we can express it, but not the capability fully of every human. I think we all are capable and of having that inside of us, but who gets to do things in certain ways publicly, or how it's interpreted from the external gaze is definitely a difference.
And I wonder what role fear and fearfulness plays in people of color's lives. Are we allowed to be scared? This is something that I've always asked, because there's always a sense of pride, a sense of culture, joy, celebration, and other complex emotions. But at what point in time have people of color ever looked at the situation and been allowed to say, I am terrified? And what would it take for that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's also, what you're describing is almost kind of who has rights to emotions, right? Who, and are we, how does, on a very base level, I think it's very easy to talk intellectually, or not very, but there's a certain level that some people feel very comfortable, including myself, you know, to talk at an intellectual level. And then, probably due to some form of intergenerational trauma, there's a real fear of showing true emotional vulnerability.
Right.
Because also I think there's this thought of how is it going to be wielded, yielded, and abused, which goes back to the intergenerational trauma, right? How will people in power use this to further the exploitation of the oppression, which is totally deep in the psyche, right? And I wonder if, I agree with you completely about the concept of whiteness and how there's a limitation there, because, you know, realistically, yeah, there is, people say that white people don't have culture. They do have culture. It's a culture steeped in some, you know, problematic stuff and not, but, you know, there's now a kind of fetishization, of course, of Black and brown people's cultures, and so there's very little, I think, given into an introspection of whiteness by, as you said, white people, which I think then leads to the idea that if not everybody is doing their own introspection, it still kind of allows the structures of power to continue, because if the microscope is now on Black and brown people's experiences, thoughts, how do we know how to be human? How do we know how to show the raw feelings when the gaze feels heavy and it feels like if we mess up, is this going to be it? Are we going to be thrown away? Are we going to be, somebody else is going to take my place? And I think there's a scared child in all of us. I think that there's a scared, our child in all of us that we don't want to confront, but we all walk around. Sometimes I think of us as walking around with kind of like raw wounds, and we like almost bumper car into each other, and it's oof, you know, but to be able to say that, to say I'm like hurting, I'm sad, I'm fearful, I'm scared of the situation, I'm scared for my life, I'm scared for my soul, I'm scared for, I think that takes a certain level of historical and power and privilege to be able to say that and be welcomed still, and not to have it used as a negative.
So you were speaking about Afrofuturism, and you were speaking about why you love it. I love it too. I love the ability to imagine other possibilities. And something that I love is that I finally get to talk about transpersonalism with a psychologist. What do you think is the relationship between altered states and their capacity for healing and our imagination and visioning another world and its capacity to heal?
So, I mean, I think that so, you know, psychology talks a lot, especially kind of psychodynamic thought, but around the idea of fantasy, right? And that the need for fantasies. Fantasy, I mean, and maybe where we can go with this too is the liminality of what is fantasy, what is reality, you know, and that goes into kind of the idea of pathology or spirituality or whatever, you know. And reality is that we're all living our own realities. Feels real to us, right? And so we kind of like need a fantasy, right? And an idea of being able to envision, say, like the future. And we were actually, the idea of control came up around how control, especially for Black and brown bodies, is almost non-existent, right? The ability to have control over something. And so the capacity to think about what can be envisioned, what we can think about in the future, is about a really beautiful way of controlling something. And then we bring in the transpersonal, which is kind of about a spiritual kind of altered space, which is also about giving up control. And so the idea of really truly playing with, I think, going to a place where you can feel like you can let down the control in almost your arms, right? And I'm thinking somehow the battlefield of life, and laying down the arms, the guns, and saying, I am going to allow what happens to me to happen, to feel safe to do that. I think is where we need to be a lot more open to the way that individuals experience this, the universe and reality and spirituality, particularly in South Africa. If, thinking of Twasa, I'm thinking of lots of different ways that people experience and explore the many dimensions that are out there. I think that we as psychologists need to be a little bit more open to what can be brought in as a way to lay down the arms of control.
I mean, I see that, and I also wonder, because you know what, the idea that I feel then gets really slippery when we open that door is the idea of the real world. Because what is real?
Yeah.
What is the real world? I can only see you guys outside of my own perception. Right? And I can't say that the world that I experience in my mind does not shape me, does not alter how I respond to this world. So then what can we say is reality? And what importance do we place on altered states, on alternative forms of sensing, feeling, and attaining information?
So, I mean, I think, I believe, and many other psychologists, I think, would agree with me that we are going in and out of mini psychosis all the time. There's this great anecdote that I have to kind of give homage to a supervisor who, he explained, like you're driving in a car and you feel like you're being followed, right? And then like you're driving, you're looking over, and then, turns out like the person's not following you, okay. But then you get like you get a nail in your tire, okay. Then your phone dies, then da-da-da-da. And, we all tend to think, like, I'm cursed. Something's wrong, you know what I mean? And there's a possibility that, that is true, of course. But then we go into this, like, deep thing of the world is against me. Everybody is out to get me, I am. And so we're constantly slipping out of, and sometimes it can just be a series of coincidences, right? But that feeling is really real, and so we're all in and out of mini psychotic states, and we have our own little mini psychosis at various moments. And I think the idea of what is reality is really complicated. And I think what I'd like to explore at some point is, which might be controversial, but the world is really bleeding. The world is going through a very, very difficult period. COVID, Ukraine, everything, everybody's lives have shifted. And my kind of thought is, if something is not happening to your sense of reality right now, who's really the sick one, right? If people are able to live their lives as they were, if they're trying to recreate a sense of normalcy prior to kind of what's been going on, or if they just don't feel anything or apathetic about what's happening, I think we need to explore what's going on for them, because I don't know how anybody cannot be impacted by that if you're paying attention.
That's huge. That's really, really huge. So I will say that what you said about we are all experiencing mini psychoses, that's liberating. Because feel like our language assimilates what used to be magical when it was coming into being. What we call a curse now, some people will accept as bad luck. But luck and magic are almost indistinguishable. It's just that one has been accepted and the other is still in the realm of fantasy. So if we are moving through this period of time and every single person is sensitive to who they are and is sensitive to different forms of perception, what we can move beyond is strict, hard and fast boundaries of what is madness, what is an alternative way of seeing the world, really seeing that animism may not have been ignorance, really seeing that psychiatry started off as a violent science and acknowledging that. And so if it stays the same way that it has, is it in service of the reality that we're in? Or is it still a way of policing what is possible for people? And I mean, I don't know, like, what is your perspective on that?
I think you've brought up so many great and very, very important points to kind of unpack, because I mean, psychiatry and in some ways psychology, especially in the history of South Africa, right? I mean, we can look at many other kind of, you know, countries and their histories, but here, I mean, it was used as a primary source of, you know, snipping and cutting off people's humanity. You know, and as you said, the privilege of who gets to be human. You know, and I think about the concept of literally using humans as subjects, right? And we see that in Tuskegee, we see that everywhere. You know, the idea of not being even offered the privilege of corporality because you are just a soulless, spiritualist lump, you know, to be exploited. And here specifically it was used to really gain control and power, and to make people feel less human. And so I think that you can't, I mean, you know, of course, as you know, Audre Lorde says about using the master's tools, right? And so I think it's, what you're bringing up is really important. How does that now shape and shift into this current day reality when do we can't just ignore the history, right? We can't just ignore something. And yet, I think that policing reality is not a way of being able to, I don't know what's kind of the reality in your head, and you don't know what's the reality in my head, right? I can't read your mind. I can read your body language, I can read your face, I can read maybe the tone of your voice, but I don't know what's going on inside of your head. And I think what we all need is maybe a little dose of curiosity, right? Because I want to know, you know, I want to see and I want to be able to hear. But whatever you say, I'm going to be curious about. And so I think we including myself, something I've had to learn, you know, as time, but to be curious about where somebody is talking from. And I don't think any one of us can really negate somebody's reality, because I have no idea what's going on there, but I want to know.
But then I wanted to ask you, like, what does being human mean to you? To you subjectively? And when you've given me what it means to you, then what does humanness mean? Because that's something that I want to unpack, because what I'm seeing in the phenomenon around me is that some of us are not willing to admit that we have a certain level of indifference to it. That it's not necessary, that human is a word that came with explanation. But what is truly real for each and every single person is I. And I cannot be said twice. And there's a mental state there that we hide behind denial. you know, that I don't know if it's gritty. I don't know if it's uncomfortable, but maybe that the liminality of what that place would mean is what we try to avoid, you know. So let's just bring it right down. What does being human mean to you?
I think that's, you know, a very hard question, but good question. There is a sense of, I think, being human means to be able to be in the space that we occupy alone and with others.
Ooh. Okay. Unpack that.
So I guess why I'm speaking hesitantly, or I'm really thinking about my words and trying to choose them carefully, because I think you're asking a question that is too important to fuck up.
There's no fucking it up.
And that's the whole point, right? And so that's why I'm policing, or even trying to think, because I think it's such a heavy question. And it's also because I'm filtering through the amount of times I've heard and seen people treat people less than human. Right? And then I think to myself, what does that mean? When I know it, I see it. I see somebody and I think, you're not treating this person like a human being. Right? So for you to ask me that question, what does it even mean to be human? When already my mind is jumping to the amount of times I see people engaging with people in ways that don't feel like they are human. Makes me, think about this idea of, to be human, I think actually is to say that I am human. If somebody can say I am human, they are human. And whether that's alone, because the idea too of humanness for me is also about engaging interpersonally. And some people hate engaging interpersonally and some people really enjoy it. But how one can be in oneself and with others. And on top of that, how they can say, if somebody says to me they're human, they're human. If a dog said to me they were human, we didn't unpack it. You know?
Okay, that is interesting, because I was thinking about what you were saying, and it was not I and me, it's two eyes, right? And from two eyes, there's a sense of, I feel significant, I see that you feel significant, I honor your sense of significance. So in my being, I do not seek to diminish how you see yourself or the significance you feel about yourself. For me, that's what accepting somebody else's humanness is that, like, we're taking away the millennial dialogue of like, we're all special, and saying, and saying we are all significant, we matter, right? And if someone acknowledges that every single person matters, and every single thing that asserts, like a buck will run like hell if you're trying to shoot it. A buck feels significant, or shows meaning. You know, it's not just survival to me. We can honor that, right? What do you think created these conditions in an embodied way, just on a human level, something that replicated itself, created these conditions where we switch off to the significance of things outside of ourselves, just on a human, like, individual level?
You know, what I hear you saying is really what kind of creates a lack of ability to empathize with somebody else, right? And how maybe even do we decide, oh, today I'm going to give extreme empathy to Tatenda, but tomorrow maybe not so much, or tomorrow I'm going to do, you know, how do we make those decisions? And and maybe also on a kind of very basic level, why do we treat people like shit? You know, why do we do that? And I mean, the reality is that there is a sense of, I think, if we're deeply wounded and if we're deeply sore and if we're deeply kind of, and we haven't done the work, I mean, to also not sound very millennial, but you know, if we haven't done some work on ourselves, I think that everybody else around us becomes very attractive punching bags for the lack of our own ability to sit with ourselves, which is why when I think of human, I don't just think of others and through the gaze of others, but I think of also the gaze that we put on ourselves. You know, we're hypercritical, I think, of ourselves. You know, we tend to all have imposter syndrome to some degree. You know, we all, I think, there's a certain level, and I don't want to go down the route of a snowflake because we're not. You know, and yet we vacillate between these extremes. Again, I think of being like we're so special and we're also worthless.
Your comfort with ambiguity, it's something that is coming through. I don't know if I'm assuming that about you. And it's something that I admire. It's something that I appreciate that. Because it takes a certain strength to be here. You know, it takes, and I think for anyone who would want to know, what was it, something that you innately have? Is that something that is part of your centered self? Is it something that you cultivated? And if it is, what is the key to it? What is the nectar for you? Just so, like, to open the door for another person to experience the freedom of that space.
Beautiful word. I do love that word, ambiguity. I guess, you know, it once again kind of comes back to the beginning of what we were talking about, and that's what I'm thinking around. That when, maybe this is everybody projecting from the various communities, saying you're this, you're that, you're this, and I think learning to live in a space of embracing things that, like these multiple identities, and saying, actually, this, just because I have a phenotypical or an external concept of ambiguity, people often can't place me depending on where I am in terms of race or you know, ethnicity. I think it's confusing for certain people depending on where I am. There's a certain, I think, kind of embracing that I've tried to do and worked really hard on. It doesn't always work. It's not always, you know, but living in a sense of the idea that actually we all have ambiguity, regardless of phenotypically how we're looking and presenting, and you know, and we all sit and live with ambiguity on the daily. If it's from external forces like the government, like you know, what's going on in a bloody pandemic. I mean, how much more, like, how much more ambiguous can we be? Right. You know, but I think if I have tried to fight it, and I think I also need to shout out to my parents, who really, I think, encouraged me gave me the reality of the world and said the world is going to be hard and people are going to want to pull on this ambiguity string and make it into something that's not. But realistically, that we all have it. We all live in a sense of a lack of clarity, of an opaqueness. And for me, I just think that I've tried to use it as a boon rather than a curse.
Sex, sexuality, and intimacy. What are some messages that you hear around sex, sexuality, and intimacy that you're just tired of? You're allowed to be tired. Like,
no, totally. I mean, I think I want to say that there is no right and wrong way to have sex.
Right.
I just think this idea of, being extremely curious about also how other people have sex, also frustrating. Just let people be. When the amount of times I've had people be like, "Oh, so you're queer," I'm like, "Oh my God, no!
Mind your business.
Mind your business. Mind your business." Why does my sex life become, who gave you permission to talk about that? And we're also out. We're in public. Have some, So I think this kind of idea that depending on who you're having sex with, allows a free for all. And I also think that who you're having sex with and your sexual orientation, also stop. It's not. Don't try to kind of make a Venn diagram of that. Just let it be. Who you're fucking, who you're enjoying intimacy with, and maybe how one wants to label. Just stop with it. It's like we're all just trying to seek pleasure here in these little moments. So I think that's kind of coming. Those are the things off the top of my head. And that sex should and I hope can be joy, but it's not always going to be that.
Okay. Oh no, now I'm listening. Dang.
Yeah.
So when you say to me, hold on, sex is not always joyful. Unpack that for me, because that's something that I would like to be challenged with.
Well, thank you for sharing that. No, I mean, and I think that is, well, I guess it's, if I think about just even the people who I know, myself, right? Even when you're starting off, to kind of explore your sex, your sexuality, everything, right? It's messy. And, I think that we were saying, have we idealized spirituality? Have we idealized sex too?
Yes! Can we have one thing?
Exactly, right? It doesn't, and it's true, the amount of times now, the millennial discourse, right, is around yes, and then I went to Tantra, and now I've found my inner flower, and I'm suddenly transcended into this other place, and I'm not knocking that, but I'm also trying to say that, the human experience is layered and complex.
Right.
And, I think that, sex can also be funny and awkward, and it can be, unexpected, and it can also be traumatic. It can be dramatic. I think that it can be a layer of things for different people, and for me, it's an avenue, whether you're having, also what is sex? You know what I mean? How are we defining that? Sex with yourself, sex with others, sex with multiple others, sex in front of people, sex not in front of, and what does sex mean? And I just think that we I don't want to drink the Kool-Aid of the fact.
Right.
I don't want to drink the goddamn Kool-Aid of what sex and sexuality can mean for somebody else. I'd rather do the work and figure that out myself. And also just not, it's not a savior. It's not.
Walked my dog, had a shag, fell asleep, that kind of thing. Sex is, people have it, right?
Yes, yeah.
But it's something that has been placed in this, it's either behind the wall of shame,
Yes.
or, the closet of control,
Right.
or in the pot of, secrecy or
Yes.
something. Why do you think we still have neuroses around sex as a society?
I mean, absolutely. Absolutely, and I think that especially in South African culture, which is quite conservative in many ways, right?
Right.
Like it conservative in the respect, I think, of when we look at, you know, like San Francisco circa now, you know, conservative is it's not meant to be a judgmental term, but, you know, I think there is still a lot of, you know, I mean, so many of my friends are like, my parent or my caregiver never spoke to me about orgasms, never spoke to me about sex or what happens. It's, you know, and it's just kind of like on your wedding day, you know.
And also,
that's right, exactly right, where you are a virgin, you know. This is how this goes, and so. You know, or it's a means to an end of you know, creating life and having a child, you know, so I think that which leads to, I think, a bit of a romanticizing of it.
Right.
Because when you are told, and think about when we're kids, right, and you're like, oh no, don't go there, don't do that. What do you want to do? You want to explore it, you want to figure it out, you know, don't go into this room. You want to go into the room. Like, so I think that there is now this extreme curiosity with something that, you're right, has been steeped in shame and secrecy. And I've also, too, had that fantasy of, like, can we all just be in a naked society? Also because I'm like, clothes up. Like, what do I wear when I get up, you know?
Yeah.
But I'm like, and so would it become... Yeah, and I guess the question that I'm going to put back, but you don't have to answer it, is like, do we want sex to become a quotidian thing? Do we want it to be like the eating, drinking, shitting, peeing, almost this kind of primitive experience? Or, you know, do we want it to be special and reserved, and, you know, or do we not want to have it at all and just put it again, you know, somewhere else, or enjoy it from afar? Or, so I mean, I don't know.
I mean, I can speak about my experience, right? So when I started practicing brahmacharya, it shifted everything about my perspective on life. It shifted everything about how I could heal, everything about how I saw myself, what I thought I was capable of. My entire Enneagram personality type changed.
Wow.
Completely unmasked everything, and I emerged from that, right? And so for me, I see sex and sexual energy as something that is so potent and so powerful. But so is breathing. And we breathe every day. So I think it's almost like what I'm sick of hearing around sex is sex as eros only, right? Because I think it takes people's power from sexual energy and the medicine of sex away. Because we're caught just in the lust of it, in the you know, that tires me.
Yeah.
Expand the message. It's this and it's that, you know, and even around like what is safe sex, what is pleasurable sex. It's something that I've been interrogating for years, because I'm like, safe and pleasurable sex are not just public health concerns, like what we need to bear in mind. There's an emotional element. From my perspective, there's a spiritual element. And you know, when you said like, what is sex? That really woke something up for me. Because what is sex? Is it the generation of your life force energy? Is it about romance? Like this, you know, I'm not going to be reductive to say, is it about romance? I don't even, you know. But when do we start entering into a sexual moment? And how do we become empowered in those? You know, like, what is your perspective?
Well, I mean, I guess, you know, what's coming up for me is also the idea of the erotic. Exactly. Your response, right? Exactly. Yummy. You know, and that's what I think of too. That you know, and of course, from a psychological perspective, you know, erotic is not. There's like there can be erotic moments between strangers, right? There can be erotic space between two very close friends, you know what I mean? And the essentializing of sexualization is something that I think it is, that's not where I want to go, you know what I mean? But I think the concept of erotic and what can, you know, that I think is a process that can happen with anybody at any time, and with myself.
Right.
You know, so I think that, you know, if there's anything to be playful about and to play with,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's when we talk about things like sex, sexuality, eroticism, not just eros, you know, and how it can be fleeting, it can be long term. I think the lack of temporality of it is also, you know, we should focus on too, because we think sex, okay, because I'm then this person, you know, comes and then we're done, you know, like, no, right?
Right.
There's a lot more, and also the way you experience it. Some people say they experience an erotic moment for a second, but it's actually 2 hours, or it's not, you know. And I think when you talk about your own experience of the spiritual connection that can happen in that moment of exploration in mind and body, I think it's kind of about a trifecta of, like, you know, your senses, your mind, and your body kind of coming together. And yet for somebody else it might not be that. It could just be literally, you know, I also don't want to speak about the possible experience of somebody else. But I think bottom line, we should talk about it.
But do you know what my opinion on polyamory is? I think there's elements of polyamory that do sound like rebellion. I also think there's elements of polyamory that sound like naming stuff that people do anyway.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
So when you speak about romantic friendship,
yes,
that already exists.
Exactly.
And not in a way, and even the idea of romance being exclusive and being like, I take you out on dates and, you know, now it's you and me, it limits what romance actually is. There's friendship that has a natural intimacy to it, that has a natural reciprocity and care to it, that is completely non-sexual.
Absolutely.
Right? And then there are other relationships that are sexual friendships, right?
Of course, yeah.
And then there's other relationships where they're not friendships, but there's sexual energy there. And that could be a once-off interaction with another human being.
Absolutely.
We do this all the time. I don't think that necessarily invalidates monogamy.